Okay, so there are several things I wanted to cover that were in chapter 1 that was not in the review and we haven't talked about yet in class. Really, it's just miscellaneous things involving evaluating expressions for the most part, and then one example where it's just simplifying a complicated looking expression. So this is pretty self-explanatory here. How do you evaluate stuff when radicals and exponents are involved at the same time? So really, I mean, the main thing with these two examples here, make sure to put stuff in parentheses as you're evaluating it. So if you plug in, so you rewrite it. It's not a bad habit to kind of, if you're plugging stuff in, just kind of make, I mean, it's a template if you know what that means, and you're just going to plug in to the parentheses. So you just put parentheses every time you see a variable that you're going to plug in for. So 2 and 5. And the thing is, remember what, I mean, it doesn't really matter, it wouldn't affect the order, but just to remind you guys, inside the parentheses is kind of, inside the radical or underneath the radical here. So it's all grouped together like parentheses, so you do everything inside first. So if there's other stuff going on, that would have to wait. So it's 4. That's all. No big deal. There's nothing exactly like that on the review packet I gave you. So I wanted to make sure to do an example of how you would handle something like this. Okay. There's nothing you can do with this. You can leave it like this. There are ways of simplifying radicals that we'll talk about more later, but you can't do anything with this one in particular. For this one, similar deal. This might look familiar as part of the quadratic formula. So this right here is the thing I wanted you to notice. The negative 8 squared. You've got to put parentheses around that one. Okay, so if you don't, then you will not get the right answer. Right? Now you don't have calculators, so that's really where a lot of students would mess up, is they just enter negative 8 squared without the parentheses and they would get the wrong answer, then it'd be an issue. The thing to remember is, if you're squaring something, squaring it at least, or raising the 4th power, 6th power, whatever, if it's an even exponent, you always get a positive answer. Alright, so this works out to be the square root of 24, which, now this is something you don't know how to do, or you don't have to know how to do yet, although you should have seen it in Algebra 2. You can split this up like this. 6 times 4 is 24. So you can split it up into two parts, and this simplifies, although it doesn't look any simpler, but sometimes we call it simplifying, as 2 radical 6. This is fine for right now. We will talk about how to simplify, do what I just did later. But if this is on a quiz or a test, then boom, this is fine. Alright. Similar deal here, in that all I wanted you to be able to do is plug in numbers. Okay? And the thing to remember is that there are kind of implied parentheses around the numerator, and I'm having technical difficulties, around the numerator and the denominator. And so you basically have to figure out the numerator and denominator first separately. Alright? You can't do any dividing until the last step will be, you might not do any dividing really technically, even though this is a division problem. Those parentheses look ugly, so I'm going to get rid of them. Alright? So does that. So it's really, I think it's wise to do this until you don't, really ever have to think about this kind of thing. Until this is totally second nature. Just put parentheses everywhere before you plug stuff in. And then boom. Alright, and then you just do order of operations. Negative 16 minus 5. Negative 8. So negative 21 over negative 4. Okay? And then, of course, two negatives divide to make a positive is 21 over 4. And really, you can leave it like this. I mean, you're not going to be working with calculators, so just leave it like this, and it's totally fine. Good general rule in this class is to just, whatever form the problem originally is in, okay, fractions or decimals, leave them as the same thing. That's really what I want. Alright, so in this case it doesn't really apply, but in general, that's a good rule for what I expect. Alright, then last but not least, problem like this where directions would say, my least favorite directions in all of math, it would say simplify. Okay. And usually, not always, usually that's just do some algebra to make it, to rewrite it with less writing. Alright, so in this case, when you simplify it, you got to remember that this negative 4 is, oops, didn't mean to do that. Well, this negative 4 is dividing this, this, and this. Okay, so you don't have to show everything about the show, but I will now, just to make it apparent, hopefully, what I'm doing. So it's 16x squared. I would never write all this out if I was just doing the problem myself. Minus. It's really the distributive property, because dividing is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So this is the same as all this, all that stuff, times negative 1/4. So it's really distributive property when you put the negative 4 with everything. It's not just some magic trick. It is one of the basic properties that you're kind of supposed to know. So it's negative 4x squared, 16 over negative 4, plus, because it's a negative over negative, 6x, then positive over negative, so it's a minus 7. Okay, and so that is simplified, and it does look simpler. And then, if you're trained real well in Algebra 2, you might think, oh, I can factor this. I should try to factor this, but don't, because it probably does not factor, because I just made this problem up randomly, and so it probably does not factor. But anyway, that's all you expect to do, and you guys will have a handful of problems that are similar to these tomorrow in class.